in God's house this morning. Will you put your hands together, make some noise? So good to be with you. As always, I wanted to welcome all of you joining us on the other sides of computer screens and tablets and phones, part of our online community. We're so glad that you are along for the ride. Today, we close the door on the series that we've been in. Did you see what I did there? Yes, we are closing the door out on the series that we have been in over the last several weeks. We've been talking about doors. We've been talking all about the spiritual implication of the doors, how they're all throughout Scripture, and all of these doors are access points. They're regulating things that regulate one space to the next. They keep the good things in and the bad things out. And today we're going to talk about one more relational door. I got one more relational door that I wanted to talk to you about that I think is really important, and it's one that everyone experiences in their life. If you notice right here on our door, this is a back door, right? It's the back door of your house. And back doors are typically synonymous with the things that you don't like, right? Don't let it slip out the back door. Don't let them come in the back door. Like that needs to go out the back door, right? It's those back door relationships. That's actually the relationships that we're going to be talking about today is the back door type. Those not so healthy relationships, the toxic relationships that can be in your life. Now, many of you have got some people in your life, and they should be like probably the greatest spiritual asset that you have. They're incredible people, but they're also some people that might be in your life that are a little less than awesome. Maybe they have the tendency or the likelihood of pulling you down, and they can be almost like a spiritual curse. And you know this, the right people in your life, they lift you up, they encourage you, they speak life into you, and they can be incredibly great spiritually to you. But there's also some people that are the wrong people in your life. And they can not just be distracting, they can be destructive. They can even be poisonous in your life. And I don't know if you know some people, like probably right now, you could think of some people that are really critical, that like they're always harping on you. Maybe they're trying to tempt you to do things that you shouldn't do. Maybe they're always really just negative. Like I believe everybody has got somebody. You probably have somebody in your mind's eye of somebody that's just kind of a negative, toxic type of personality. Help me out today. Would you raise your hand if you can think of somebody that you're worse around than when you're not around them? Come on, lift up your hand. Yeah, look around the room. Everybody, just leave them up for a minute. Look around the room at how many different toxic people are in people's lives. Like you've got some people in your life, right, that are toxic. And these people are difficult and dealing with toxic relationships because there's so many people in our life that can be negative and damaging. I feel like we need to talk about them. And so right there at the top, what I wanted to do is kind of give us a working definition of what a toxic relationship is like. So right there at the top of your notes, it's got a definition of what's toxic. And something that's toxic is anything that contains poisonous materials capable of causing sickness or even death. Now, maybe you've never thought about it this way, but actually everybody here has got some toxic material inside of them, some poisonous material. The Bible word for it is sin, right? And everybody has got some sin inside of us, and sin can cause sickness and ultimately death. And there are some people that haven't figured out ways to handle properly that sin in their life, and so they can be more and more toxic to you. And I think it's because of that reason that the Apostle Paul said this phrase in 1 Corinthians 15:33. He said, do not be misled. And I think he said that intentionally because I think it's so easy to be misled in this area. Like you think, wow, they're not that bad, right? I mean, like they're a little negative or whatever, but it's not that really that bad. Well, Paul says, no, don't be misled. Bad company corrupts good character. Now, for a long time, I used to think it was the opposite. I actually thought, well, good company can be that thing that lifts up bad character. Like if I'm life-giving and I'm healthy, then I'll go into a toxic environment, a toxic relationship, and I'll do what I can. I'll pull them up. But according to Paul, he said, actually, it's the opposite. He said it's much more likely that toxic relationship, that person that's negative, has the ability to pull you down quicker than you have the ability to pull them up. And it's actually really true. He says, don't be misled, because good company, right? Good character can be corrupted by bad company. You get around the wrong people, and they can pull you down, drag you down in your life. I'll never forget when my kids were little. My boys were like 6 or 8 years old. And we were at the church. They were playing out in the church, outside in the church, and they were playing with other little church friends. And I was inside and I was working, and I'll never forget my 8-year-old, the older brother, he came running in and he looked really concerned. And he said, "Dad, Joey said a bad word." And I said, "Okay, well, what was it?" He said, "No, it's a really bad word. He said the S word." And I said, "What?" And because he's playing with church kids. I'm like, what little heathen child has taught my kid the S word, right? And I'm like, because I know he's not learning it from me. He might be learning it from his mother. I'm playing. So I know he wasn't learning it from us, but I thought, and these are church kids. How is he learning the S word? So I said, "Go get your brother, bring him in here." And so he did. He brought Joey inside. Joey's like 6 years old, and he looked like the cat that ate the canary. You know what I'm talking about? Like, he's like, wouldn't even look at me. I said, "Joe, did you say a bad word?" And he just stared at the ground. And I said, "Well, Tom said you said a bad word." And just to make sure we were on the same page, I said, "Tom, what is the S word?" And he said, "Dad, I can't repeat it." I said, "No, you're not going to get in trouble. Just whisper it in my ear. Like, what's the S word?" And so he, cautiously approached me and he said, "Well, Dad, Joey said, shh." And I thought, well, here we go. This is it. He said, what heathen child has taught my kid how to cuss? And then he said, "Shut up." And I said, "Oh, thank God." And they both looked at me, and I was like, "No, don't say that either. Like, don't tell your brother shut up." But I thought it could have been so much worse, because I know some S words, right? Because bad company, right, has corrupted my good character over the years. And the truth of the matter is it's easy to come around people that are toxic, and if they're not careful with their language, that they can pull you down like that. And I know that's funny, but the truth is Paul's right. It can corrupt, it can damage, it can destroy. And let me show you a verse that he says that I think is actually pretty extreme when it comes to this. He says this on how toxic relationships can be in 2 Timothy. He said, "Avoid godless chatter, because those who indulge in it will become more and more ungodly." So in other words, he says, don't get around sinful people that are they're unable to control their talk, they're unable to control their language, because it's not going to build you up, it's going to tear you down. The stuff that they say, the things that they talk about have the ability to pull you further and further away from God. You're not going to get closer around them in those relationships, because toxic people have that ability. Instead of being the thing that builds you up, it corrupts a good character. And we become less and less like God. Now watch this. In verse 17, he said this: "Their teaching will spread like gangrene." Now, I don't know if you've ever studied gangrene. It's a pretty nasty disease. And the way gangrene works is it typically you get like a little cut, and that gets infected. And that infection works its way, and it gets a blockage into your body. What normally would be a normal, healthy, operating part of your body now has a blockage, and no blood flow can get to it. And when that happens, that normal, healthy part starts to die. And once it dies, it rots and falls off. That's pretty graphic terminology for what Paul is saying. He says that that's going to happen if you get around the wrong type of people. Toxic, negative people have the ability to damage you in that way. And so many times I think we get misled. We think, oh, it's not that bad. Well, I'm saying Paul says it's so damaging and so dangerous, you might need to cut them out of your life in some way. So what I want to do today is kind of look at just a few different types of these toxic personalities. And I'm not saying this is exhaustive, like this is every one of them, but these are the three that I tend to see most frequently. And so I put them in your notes right there at the top, number one in your notes. See if you don't know somebody like this: the chronically negative. The chronically negative people. This is wherever you are, whatever you're doing, they just always seem to pull it down, right? They're just always judgmental. They're always critical. Maybe they're always gossiping. They're always complaining. Like nothing is ever really good enough. You get around them and it's like, wow, yeah, maybe things really do stink. You know, it's just like everything is bad, everything is negative. If you were here the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about the Israelite people and how God delivered them out of bondage of slavery and their sin and all of this stuff, and he got them out of it. And as soon as they got out of it, this is what they would be like, because they were immediately complaining. They were complaining and saying, oh, it's never going to get any better. It's so terrible. It's torturous. I think we were better off being slaves. Like there are toxic, negative people that are chronically negative in your life. That would be one type of negative person. Here's another person, the controller. These are controlling, overbearing people, right? They're manipulative. They can even be abusive. They will use their language to intimidate you. Sometimes you can be afraid to even be around them because you're like, I don't want to say the wrong thing because I know that they're going to act that way. Like, raise your hand if you know some manipulative, controlling people. Some of you are like, no, don't point. Like, yeah. some of you are pointing with your eyes. It's like, yeah, I know somebody right there. Like, and others are like, man, I'd like to raise my hand, but they're right next to me and they're controlling me. I just can't. Yeah, exactly. Right? So you got negative people that are in your life. You got controlling people. And here's the third kind of category of toxic people that you'll run into, the tempter. These are tempting people, right? These are people that are in your life that are trying to get you to do something you know you're not supposed to be involved in. And you know that you shouldn't be doing it. Maybe it's a boyfriend that's trying to tempt you sexually to do something that you're not comfortable with, that you want to honor God with your body, and maybe they're trying and pull you into something that you know you shouldn't be doing. You might be trying to honor God and pursue a Christian spouse, and they're constantly trying to get you to think about things or go to places. Like they're always saying, like you're trying to pursue the man or woman of your dreams, and they're like, hey, come on, let's go clubbing, let's go drinking, we'll have a blast doing this. And you're looking for your dream person, right? Can I just tell you, your dream spouse is not going to be drunk and throwing up at 2 a.m. I'll just help you, you know? And so like these are good, they're good people, they're fun friends, but they're trying to pull you into doing something that you know you're not supposed to do. And you're smarter than that, but you still end up going because you want to be a good friend. Maybe they're texting you something that you know you shouldn't be looking at. This is true for guys a lot of times. Like a lot of their buddies, maybe they're good buddies, but they're texting you something that visually you're trying to stay away from. You're trying to keep, like Job, he said, I made a covenant with my eyes, not to look lustfully on any maiden, on any woman. And sometimes guys will send each other texts. Maybe this is the person that's trying to tempt you with stuff like that. Or maybe it's not even anything in a sexual way. Maybe they're just overly materialistic. Right? And every time you get around them, you find them looking at, you look at the vehicle and you think, man, maybe I should have a nicer thing like that. And you're trying to save money and trying to live by a budget, and they're just pulling you in this area. Whatever these are, these people, it's amazing how easy it is to get sucked into relationships like that. And you find yourself behaving in a certain way. And it's not that they're bad. They're not horrible people. It's just when you're around them, it doesn't pull out God's best inside of you. It's like something that they do kind of rubs off on you, and rather than becoming the person that God has called you to be, you find yourself in a different area. And these different types of people, they're not just annoying and negative, they're actually pulling you down. They're damaging you. They're destroying your relationship with God. Little by little, they're chipping away. Now, what I want to do is just kind of unpack this for a minute. And look at this, because each one of us can be toxic in our own way. And for all of us, our goal should be to bring life-giving relationships in around us, right? We want to bring life into the relationships, but a lot of times it can be really challenging if you're not spiritually healthy to be able to do that to anybody around you and to help in that way. And just recently, I was on an airplane flying back from South Carolina, and when I got in there, the stewardess got on there and she went through her spiel. You know, it's like it's 2024. Who doesn't know how to make the buckle, work? I mean, like it's a seatbelt, But they go through the whole spiel every single time. And once they're done with that spiel, they tell the one thing. And usually I kind of zone out and tune out of this. But one time I was sitting there and God said, hey, pay attention to this. And they said, if in the event of a loss of cabin pressure, these little masks will pop out of the ceiling, right? And you're supposed to put them on there so you can breathe. And they said this interesting thing. They said, now your first instinct will be to help the person next to you, especially if it's a child. You want to help that person next to you. But they said, don't do that. And I always used to think, that sounds really kind of selfish. Like, why shouldn't I help that person? Well, they said, listen, if you do that, you won't get the oxygen yourself. You'll pass out, they'll pass out, nobody gets help. And so when that happens, what you want to do is firmly secure your mask, take a deep breath, and then you'll have the oxygen to be able to help somebody else. That's what we're talking about today. It's not that we're shutting anybody else out of our lives. We're just making sure that we're going to be healthy so that we can bring life into the relationships around us. And so what I want to do is look at just a couple of simple biblical principles on how to handle and manage and effectively deal with the toxic relationships in our life. Because remember, all throughout this series, what we've been saying is that the door regulates things. Right? It has the ability, the power to regulate one environment to the next. And so the first thing that you need to understand when you're trying to deal with toxic and negative people in your life is, number one, in your notes. You need to write this down. You need to learn how to set healthy boundaries. That's what a door is, really. Right? It's a healthy boundary. It keeps some things out and allows some things to stay in. And what do boundaries do? But they regulate stuff. And again, it's not that these people are horrible. It's not that they're bad people. It's just there's a part of or an aspect about their personality that could be dangerous to you, that can pull you down. And again, this does not sound like a very Christian thing. It's like, oh, I don't know, Pastor Tom, that doesn't sound like a very Christian thing for me to do, is to just shut them down. Well, you need to understand this, that boundaries are biblical. Boundaries are actually one of the most Jesus-like things that you can do, because Jesus set up a lot of different boundaries. You don't think so? He loved everyone equally, but he didn't treat everybody equally, right? He chose 12 disciples, not 12,000 disciples, right? He just chose a certain amount. Sometimes he would come into a crowd, into an area, and he would heal a couple people, but he wouldn't heal all the people. Sometimes he would come into a crowd, he wouldn't heal anyone. There were moments where he would get away from his disciples, those people that he chose, those 12 disciples. He would get away from them and spend 40 days alone with God. And he would take this time alone with God to fill up on the presence of God before coming back into this environment. Think about how he handled the Pharisees. These were like the hyper-religious people. You know what I'm talking about? Like they were overly, and they were judgmental. You know how he handled them? He kept them at an arm's distance. He said, I'm not listening to you. In fact, I'm not going to tell you everything there is to tell, because there's something about you that's toxic. And he just made a decision in his mind that he was going to handle them that way. A couple of weeks ago, Pastor Jerry talked about, and he was dealing with unforgiveness. And he talked about the porcupine. And by the way, if you missed that message, you need to go back on our YouTube page or our website and go check that out. It's an amazing message on forgiveness. But in there, he said that there's some people it's like hugging a porcupine, right? And you want to pick them up and you want to draw them close. But when you do, it's like their quills stick in you. And that's how some people can be. It's not that they're terrible. It's just you want to love some people, but they're just not developed at a place where you feel like you can love them at that kind of distance. Some people you have to love at a distance, right? You got to hug them from a distance. You want to love them, but they've got some growth to do, and they've got some maturing to do before you can pull them into your life, because otherwise they're just going to pull you down into their dysfunction. And so what you've got to do is you've got to learn how to, for the glory of God, set up some healthy boundaries in your life. These are healthy boundaries. And so here's what I want to do. I want to just give you some very practical things that you can do to set up some boundaries in your life. This is ways to close the toxic door on some relationships in your life. And here's one, and this is, if someone is really demanding, maybe they keep trying to pull you into the wrong things. They keep trying to tempt you in some way, or maybe they're overly critical and they keep coming. You just want to very calmly set up this boundary, and I want you to learn this phrase. You can say this to them in a life-giving way. You can say, you know what? I just don't want to talk about that. I can't be talked to that way. That's a great way of saying it. It's actually really healthy. You can't talk to me that way. Right? And it can be a challenging thing to say, but if you can learn how to say it, when they keep trying to drill down in your life, you just look at them and say, hey, listen, very calmly, I'm not going to be talked to that way. You can't talk to me that way. I'm not going to be talked to that way. Maybe you've got that friend that is always like negative, or maybe you get around that group and they're always gossiping. You know what I mean? Like they're just constantly talking about all that gossip stuff. And by the way, one of the worst places that can happen is Christian circles. You know what I mean? Like prayer circles. We can use the prayer circle. It can be a great excuse to hide some gossip, right? We say, y'all need to pray for brother so-and-so because you will not believe the stuff that he is into. Let me tell you, right? And then we use it as an excuse to just gossip. Right? This is what we do sometimes. And when you get into this is not being a jerk. This is not being mean. When you find yourself in that scenario where they're talking like that, rather than allowing that poison to get into you, you just look at them and say, you know what? I'm just not going to talk about that. I'm just going to close myself out. You'll be amazed at how quickly that'll close the door. When you say, I'm just not willing to talk about that, people will shut down and they'll stop that gossip talk right away. Ladies, some of you are married. And you might find, I see this all the time, that ladies that are married are getting into conversations with other married women, and they're all cutting their husband down. And they're really negative, and they're just talking all about the negative aspects of their husband. And this can be very catching, right? Like one can jump on the next one, and they can pull on that. And next thing you know, everybody's talking about the negative aspects of their spouse. And I'm just telling you, like, if you don't want to be part of that, if you want to shut the toxic door to that, you can really simply just say this phrase. You can say, you know what? My husband's not perfect, but he's running towards Jesus. I know that he's doing everything in his power to try and become more and more like Jesus, and I'm just not going to talk about that. And you'll be amazed at how quickly that sucks the air out of that conversation. They won't talk about that because you just say, I just don't want to be polluted in that way. I don't want to pollute my mind. Maybe, guys, you have a buddy, and he's a good friend, and you're over at the gym all the time, but he's all the time trying to point you in the direction of something you shouldn't be looking at. He's like, man, check out how hot that chick is. And you're just trying to be pure, right? You're trying to live a different kind of life. then what you got to say is like, listen, man, I'm just not going to talk about that. See, this is so simple, but can I be honest with you? It's really challenging. It's such a simple thing to understand, but it's a hard thing to do because nobody wants to be a wet blanket. And I don't want to be that person that's like, but I'm telling you right now, if good character can be corrupted by bad company, they can poison you. They can set this into your spirit. And if you want to be everything that God has called you to be, then you've got to learn to create some healthy boundaries in your life. And you can't just expect that they're going to realize that you've got a boundary by your silence too. By the way, like, well, I just won't talk about that. No, that won't stop them. Like, you've got to draw a line in the sand and say, hey, listen, I'm not going to talk about this anything further. Let me give you another phrase that you can use. This one's really helpful. You might even want to jot this down somewhere in your margin. Just say this: I'm going to have to pass on that. Say that out loud with me. Say, I'm going to have to pass on that. I'm just going to have to pass on that. Like, it's really easy, right? To just say, like, somebody starts talking about something, whatever negative thing that is, and you just say, hey, listen, I'm going to have to pass on that. Whatever that is. And that's different for everybody. Like, that might be something different in your life, and there's some area, some aspect that you know that you're not supposed to be doing. And this is not saying, hey, listen, you can even say this: I'm not judging you, I'm not talking down, I'm not trying to preach at you. It's just for me, I'm going to have to pass on that, because for me in my life and where I'm going, that's just not where I'm going to be. Right? Last week we talked about the generational door. Maybe you had a problem with alcohol in your past. And now you're clean and you're sober, and you got that one friend that always wants to go out for drinks, and they're like, hey, man, let's go clubbing, let's go to the bar, and they don't mean anything negative by it, but you know that if you were to walk into that door, that it's just going to pull you down. And so what you have to learn to say is, hey, I'm just going to pass on that. I got to pass on that. I just got to draw a line in the sand and say, I'm not going any further than that. If you're married, and maybe you're at the office, and you've got that coworker, and the lines are getting blurry, right? She laughs at all your jokes. You're hilarious to her, and your wife just isn't doing it. And so when you get to the office, that's fun, and that's or whatever that situation is, and this conversation is going a little bit farther than it needs to, and they say something like, man, I love working with you. Let's go out to lunch. I'm just going to have to pass on that. That's what you say. Because we're just going to make a decision. I'm going to make a line in the sand that like, listen, that's not something that I can do. And I'm just trying to drive this point home, because I have seen this happen so many times. I'm trying to save myself work is what I'm doing here, because I've been in a lot of counseling sessions with people. And you know what the number one, especially with guys, can I just be honest with you? The number one thing that I hear out of guys' lips when I'm starting to counsel and their life is falling apart is they say this phrase. They say, I never thought that was going to happen to me. Da, 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 da. And if you're sitting here thinking, yeah, I get that, Pastor Tom, that sounds great, but that's never going to happen to me. I'm just saying, be cautious about that, because no one ever thinks that'll happen to them. And you just got to set some strong boundaries in your life. You got to make some hard lines. Like, guys, we don't go out to eat with an old boyfriend. We don't go out to eat with the old girlfriend. Don't seek out them on social media and start texting them. Just make a hard line that this is what I'm not going to do. That's a line for me. Ladies, if you're dating somebody and he's trying to start putting the moves on you, you know what I'm saying? You just say, you're a fine-looking thing. Go back up in a good way, okay? You just say, if you like it, then you should have put a ring on it. You know what I'm saying? Like whatever it is that you got to say, hey, that might work for you, but I'm trying to live a different kind of life. I know I'm a dad. It's okay. Some dads ought to be helping me right now. And I'm just telling you, some of you ladies right now, you've just decided that whatever it is that they want to do, that I'm just going to allow my morals and my integrity to go out the window, and they slip in that way. And I'm saying that God is trying to tell you, you're better than that. Don't for a minute negate the fact that God has somebody good for you. Somebody incredible for you, and maybe you've been praying about it and asking God to bring in a relationship in that way. Well, a couple of weeks ago, we started off this series about talking about the types of doors. Remember that revolving door? And for many of you that are in dating relationships, maybe you find your relationships keep ending the same way. Well, maybe that's just because you keep starting them the same way. And God is trying to align something for you. You've been praying for that man of God, like that he would come in, and he's going to be the man of your dreams, and he's going to sweep you off your feet, and he's going to do these things. I'm saying if you're praying about that, God is also answering the prayer of that man who's praying for a virtuous woman. And that woman is exactly who God wants to put together with. He wants to make that revolving door just perfect to where the two align. But you have got to be the answer to that man's prayers. Guys, sometimes you're praying and believing that God would bring that woman into your life, and you're praying and saying, God, would you just bring her in? Well, that woman is also praying for a man of integrity. And so in order to get that, you've got to make a decision that I'm going to have some boundaries in place. And you've got to say to some things, I got to pass on that. When they try to tempt you and they try to criticize you and they try and pull you down and abuse you, you've got to say, I've got to pass on that. Now, here's the truth, and this is my second point, and this might be a little dramatic to some of you. You might think, well, that's kind of like a dramatic thing, but you might not agree with it, but I stand by it 100%. And if they continue to try and come at you and try and pull you down and try and speak negatively and all of these different things, in some cases, number 2 in your notes, you need to learn how to close and lock the toxic door. There's some people in your life that you've got to learn to close and lock the door. Now, I want to be really clear on this. I'm not talking about divorce. Don't use this as an excuse. Like you leave here today and say, see, I've been telling you this, and PT said you are a toxic person, so now I can get rid of you. That's not what I'm saying, okay? Like if you've got a toxic relationship inside of your marriage, it's because there's toxicity in both of you. And sin brings about sickness. If you were sick, you'd go to a doctor. And if that is happening in your marriage, you need to go to a counselor or a pastor or a marriage small group. Start somewhere and start working on that. That's not what I'm talking about. And I'm also not talking about family. I'm shocked sometimes at some people that will say, man, that's it. I'm just cutting off my parent. I'm done with them. I'm not going to talk to my dad anymore. Or how many parents will say, that's it, I'm cutting them off. I'm not talking to my child anymore. No, that's a covenant relationship. We work through these things, and we try to make these things work. I'm talking about different types of relationships. When there's a relationship in your life that is abusive and it's a relationship issue, this is not like, well, she said so-and-so, so I'm just not talking to her anymore. No, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about stuff that has gone to a level that you know this is not healthy. This doesn't need to exist here in this place anymore. And for those that you need to say, hey, I'm going to have to close and lock the door in this relationship. There's examples of this all throughout the scripture. Paul and Barnabas were 2 guys that were doing incredible things for God. They're expanding the gospel. They're spreading it everywhere, doing these amazing things. Well, they had a big falling out over a guy. Like there's this guy, and they could not see eye to eye on this guy. And this one wanted to go one way, and this one wanted to go another. And rather than just allowing their relationship to blow up and be damaged forever, they said, hey, I tell you what, you go this way, I'll go that way, and that way we can both be effective in ministry. And so what they were effectively doing is they were finding an area that they just never could find commonality on, and they just decided we're going to close the door on that. There might be some people in your life that are just absolutely, you do not need to be around. Your family doesn't need to be around. And this is how it says in the Old Testament. It says, do not intermarry with them. There were some people that God says, don't intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons. These people were worshiping pagan gods. And God says, listen, if you get around them, they're just going to suck you into their false religions. And he says, don't get around that. Don't be part of that. In fact, in the New Testament, it says, do not be yoked together with unbelievers. For what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? Or what fellowship can light have with darkness? In other words, what he says is don't partner up with unbelievers. And now, I believe that you should have as many non-Christian friends as you possibly can so that you can pull them into a relationship with Jesus. I think that's incredible. I think you need to do that. You need to seek out those relationships and try to pull them into relationship with Jesus. But he's saying don't date an unbeliever. And certainly don't marry them. Don't go into business. Don't become a business partner with somebody that's an unbeliever. But why? Because your values are so not going to align. And when that happens, it's going to be challenging. It's going to be really difficult for you to move forward in the way that God wants for you because you're yoked together with somebody that's trying to do the exact opposite. Last week we talked about in the Old Testament Joseph and how he closed off the generational door that was trying to damage his family line, and he instead decided to send blessings forward. And he closed that off. Well, you know what Joseph did? He found himself in a situation where he was working for someone that was an unbeliever. And he was doing everything that he could for their family. He was helping them in every way. But he got to a place where it became unhealthy because one day, Potiphar's wife, that's the man's name, his wife, came on to him in a really inappropriate way. And it says that Joseph she was making the moves on him, and he just immediately cuts it off. This is what it says. It says in Genesis 39, it says that she, Potiphar's wife, caught Joseph by the cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. You want to talk about commitment right there. Like, I hope the brother was wearing underwear. You know what I mean? Like, because like he was like, "No, that's fine. Like, you got to catch me." You know, like he was moving. He's like, "You like the shirt? Keep it. I'll get another one on Temu." You know what I'm saying? Like, that's how you say it, by the way, too. I learned it. Yeah, he's Temu. And so like Joseph said, "Listen, I am so committed to living the life that God has called me to live that I'm willing to leave a shirt behind. I've got to do whatever it takes to get out of there." And for some of you, you need to make that decision. Like if God is pulling you out of a relationship right now that is not godly, that is not moving you forward, that is not doing something to increase where you've got to set a healthy boundary. And you got to be willing to say, "Hey man, keep the shirt." For you, if you're a teenager, maybe they're sending you a text that you know is inappropriate, a sext, right? This is where they send sexual images to one another. This is very, very common now in middle school and high school. They're sending them to one another. And if somebody sends you that and you try to block them, you block them. Say, "Listen, I'm not into that. I'm going to pass on that. I'm deleting it and done." And if they keep sending them, block their number. And if you can't get them to stop there, change your phone number. Like, you've got to make a decision that I'm drawing a line in the sand, that I'm different. I'm shutting the door to this toxic relationship and I'm locking it. And whatever that is, maybe it's a business partner, and that business partner will not stop. He wants to do something unethical because he knows that it's going to drive up the profits. And if that's the case, you need to shut the door and lock it. You need to say, "Hey, listen, I'm going to have to buy you out, or you're going to have to buy me out. Because we can still be friends, but we cannot be business partners. Because I'm just making a decision. We're going to have to go our separate ways." If you're flirting with somebody at the office, and they're flirting with you, and you're married, can I just tell you, you're playing with toxic waste. It's damaging. Don't pass it up and say, "Oh, it's harmless, it's no big deal." Oh, no, I'm telling you, it's damaging. You just got to draw a line in the sand and say, "Listen, this is where I am, and I want you to hear me in this. Get out of there immediately. Leave the shirt if you have to, but leave." And I know a lot of times that this can be a challenging thing. Ladies, maybe you're dating somebody, and your mom says he's a jerk, and your dad says he's a jerk, and everyone in your small group says he's a jerk, and your best friend says he's a jerk. Guess what? He's a jerk. Okay? You don't have to stay in that relationship, and you don't have to stick around. Let me just tell you something. Like what I was just telling a young couple this last week. Whatever they are now, they're going to be a bigger one later. Okay, if you're dating them now and they're a little version of that now, come on, married people, they're a great big version of that later, right? He's just a little messy. He's a full-out slob when you're 3 years into the marriage. You know what I'm talking about? Like she's just like she spends a little bit. She's a little spendy. Like we're maxed out all the cards, Pastor. We have nothing left, right? Like whatever they are now, they're going to be a bigger one later. Like it's just the truth. If he drinks a little too much now, he's a full-blown alcoholic later, and let him deal with those issues now. I'm just saying, listen, it's not they're horrible people, but you're trying to go in a different direction. You want to go to where God's calling you to be. And let them deal with those issues now. Don't think for a minute that God can't have somebody better for you. He loves you. He's for you. And I want to make something really abundantly clear. Like when it comes to closing and locking this door, that ought to be one of the very last resorts for a Christian. Because it's a really challenging thing to do. To say, I'm not just going to close the door, it's locked to you. And that... It's not to say that this is a mean thing to do, or it's a hard thing. And every time it should be done in love. Like, listen, man, I love you. I'm praying for you. It's just we're going different directions. If I be honest, this is more frequent if you're younger, like if you're in your 20s or if you're a teenager. Because, you know, by and large, you're exposed to more toxic type behavior when you're younger. But you might be walking with the Lord for a while. Or maybe you just came to find Jesus or renew your commitment with God. This is where you'll see these things happening a lot. Or maybe you just came out of a relationship and you're feeling vulnerable. This is where you see these things happening. And when you have these toxic relationships, and I'm not saying like, okay, you get to a place where it's like, well, I got 18 healthy relationships, not going to have any more, I'm shutting them all down, right? No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying just like you've got to make a decision, a Christian perspective that I'm going to honor God. I'm going to honor God with my life, and I'm going to do something in a positive way. One more thing on this, like especially if you're dating, stop missionary dating. Some dad ought to be helping me right now. Like I'm all for missions, and I'm fine with dating, But there's this thing where it's like women do, especially. Like they're like, I'm going to get him to Jesus. He doesn't go to church now or believe in Jesus, and he's actually really kind of doing this pagan thing. But he's going to get to Jesus because he loves me, right? It just doesn't happen. I've seen it so many times later on. Whatever they are now, they're going to be a bigger one later. And I'm not trying to be mean or harsh or cruel on this. I'm saying there are some relationships that we shouldn't be yoked together with because they're not helping you. And you're praying for them. And you're leading them to church. And you say, hey, man, get to church. And you're hoping that God gets to them. But you're not going to join yourself together with this person because they're just pulling you down in a toxic way. And for those relationships, you got to close the door. Lock it. And don't return back to it. You know, Jesus, when he spent 40 days up on the mountain, he spent 40 days around the Father because he wanted to surround himself with that. He wanted to become so full of the presence of God, so full of the Holy Spirit, because he knew that he was about to come back down and minister to toxic people. And he had to be so full of the Holy Spirit, so full of the Spirit of the living God, so that he could open up the blind eyes, and he could unlock the deaf ears, and he could get around the lepers that no one wanted to touch. And he had to be so full of God. And I'm just saying that some of you today, in the same strength and power, you need to do that exact same thing. You need to get so full up on Jesus so that you can minister in these different environments, and so you can get to this place where you can help other people. But you'll never do it as long as there's a toxic door that's open in your life, and they're constantly feeding you poison. In some of those cases, you got to close it. You got to lock it. You got to say, Jesus, I'm going to get around you. I'm going to fill up on you. I'm going to get around the people of God, and we're going to celebrate who you are. I'm going to make a determination, a line in the sand that I'm running after God, and I'm going to stay so full of him that I'm able to minister to the people that are in the toxic environments. Some of you today need to hear from the Holy Spirit, and you need to create a boundary, a healthy boundary. Or in some cases, you might need to close and lock a door somewhere. And you need to hear from the Lord on that.